Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Dolin, and today we're talking about the SAT or the ACT, navigating the new roadmap to college. For the last 23 years, my tutors and I have been helping students to prepare for the SAT and the ACT to create a roadmap for all of their applications, the due dates, the essays involved, and to help them complete that essay, all those essays in time for early action, regular decision, or just plain to get everything done on time. All right, so let's get started and talk not just about the present, but what's happened in the past and all of the changes that have influenced where we are right now in terms of testing. So I first want to share with you a survey of college admissions factors from 2019. This was a survey done from NACAC, and NACAC is the National Association for College Admissions. And so college counselors, these are folks in universities and college that read students' applications, were asked, what is important for you when you decide on a student's acceptance to your school? And here's what they said. 89% of those surveyed said that grades in college prep courses were the most important things. So not just grades in regular classes, but specifically in classes like AP, IB, or dual enrollment classes. Number two, the strength of the curriculum, coming in at 87%. And that means how many AP, IB, depending on your school, or dual enrollment classes did the student take. And then the other third most important factor at 82% were scores on the SAT and the ACT. And all the other things were important, but not nearly as important as these top three factors. Things like recommendations from the counselor or teachers, essays, extracurricular activities, and demonstrated interest, they all mattered, but not so much. Now things are different. And now, as just coming into 2022, the one thing that has changed the most is the influence of testing. And that's because many schools have become test optional. This was a trend before the pandemic, but the pandemic really pushed it in that direction because not every student had access to take a test. So when it comes to the SAT and ACT, they're still important, but it really varies by school. And the requirements in terms of what colleges want are different. So colleges fall into three categories. Either they're required, and this is about 5% of colleges nationwide. That means that they require you to submit a test score if you want to be considered for their school. For example, in the state of Georgia, all of the state schools require students to submit a test score. But the majority now are considered test optional. And that means that students can submit a test score if they want, but they're not required. And the school says they won't hold it against the student if they don't submit a score. We'll talk about this test optional movement in detail in just a few minutes. And then the last category of schools is called test blind. And test blind means that they really honestly do not look at test scores. Test scores are not important in their decision. So even if a student submits test scores to a test blind school, they won't even look at them. And it's very, very few schools that are in this test blind category. Really, most schools and many of the schools we'll talk about today are in this test optional group. So let's talk about where we are in the state of Virginia. Most of the students we work with, although now it's nationwide, for many years, most of them were in Virginia. And so let's take a look at where we are by individual school. Virginia Tech, it's a very competitive school. They just went test optional. In fact, they were the last school to go test optional in the spring of 2021. But all the other ones have been test optional even before that. UVA said, we're going to do a pilot. We're going to see how it goes without any scores and see if there's a difference in preparedness of our students. And they said, we're going to do this for 2 more years and then make a decision. William and Mary is on a 3-year test optional pilot. JMU has been test optional for a while. George Mason, actually the first school to go in this direction. And then schools like Christopher Newport and even VCU. But with VCU, they still would like to see a test score. So if you have one, they would like to see it at VCU, which is a little bit different than all the other schools. But the bottom line is, technically, you don't have to submit a score. But the reality is that a score can help you. Here's why. There's more applications than ever before for the same number of slots. And here's a headline from USA Today. College applications pour in because of optional ACT, SAT scores amid COVID-19. And so when kids weren't able to test, we saw this a lot in 2020, and to some degree 2021, but really when they couldn't take a test and sit for a test in 2020, colleges said, you know what, it's not really fair if some kids are able to take a test and others, their tests were closed or they were canceled. We're just going to make it test optional across the board. And so when that happened, kids that may not have applied to a very selective school because they didn't fit into that testing range, but they had good grades, all of a sudden those kids said, oh, you know what? I'm just going to throw my hat in the ring and see what happens. So we saw this more and more at very selective schools that maybe kids wouldn't have gotten into or applied to before. Overall, when it's averaged out, most colleges this past year received about 11% more applications than before the pandemic. But at selective schools, they saw at least 21% more applications. Some schools more than others. So for example, Virginia Tech last year, they got 42,000 applications for just 6,700 spots. And it doesn't mean that they only accepted 6,700. Of course, you're going to accept more than actually go, because some kids will go to other places. But you can see the imbalance here. They're getting more applications than ever before. And it's not just at large flagship state schools, also smaller universities like Colgate. They received they had 17,000 students apply in 2020, the cycle before last, and that's a 100% increase over the prior year. We also see this in large schools like NYU that was very selective before the pandemic, but now it's virtually impossible. They got more than 100,000 first-year applications last year. So we know that schools are receiving more applications than ever before. So the question is, how do you help your child to stand out? Well, one way you can help your students stand out is by having them sit for and take a test and submit the test to schools that deem that score a good score. So it leads us to the question that we're often asked by parents. And when parents call our office looking for help with the college admissions process as a whole, or just for test prep, they'll often ask, what is a good score? What should my child be aiming for? And the answer is a good score is relative because it depends where you want to go. So for example, if you take a school like William and Mary is very selective. Part of the reason it's really selective is because a lot of kids want to go there and it's a fairly small school, so they don't have a ton of slots. Now, in 2019, when they were accepting applications with scores, students that fell within the mid 50th percentile range, which means they were between the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, those students were scoring between 660 and 740 on SAT reading. And by the way, the top score is 800. We'll dive into that in just a few minutes. And then in math, they reported scores in the mid 50th percentile between 660 and 770. Those are high scores. On the ACT, which is a top score of 36, they showed that kids were coming in that range between a 30 and a 34. Very competitive, very high scores. So a score, if you want to apply it to William and Mary, for example, even though they're test optional, and say you have an ACT score of a 32 or somewhere in that range, you may want to send it with your application because it can help. However, if your score is, say, a 25, you wouldn't want to send it with your application because it's not going to help. It's not within their range, especially if your grades are good. You wouldn't want to send a score because it's not in that range. However, at another school, that score of 25 might be really good. And you might want to send your application. Maybe it's a safety school. You might want to send your test score to a school where that is considered in the range. The thing is, you own the data. So this is different than it was even 5 or 6 years ago when that wasn't the case. I remember when my older son applied for colleges, he's 23 now, and the schools he applied to, and this is not unique, wanted all of his scores. And I remember in one administration, he didn't do too well, but the others, he did well. He had to send everything. It's not the case anymore. You own the data, so you can send the scores you want to send. So here are the pros and cons of submitting a score. The pros are if you submit a score and it's helpful, it's in the range, especially at the top portion of the range, it gives the school another data point to look at. And it also shows that your child took initiative to study, prepare, and to take a test. The cons, however, would be that it is one less data point. So if you don't submit a score, it's likely the admissions team is going to give greater scrutiny to other parts of your application, like your grades, of course, because that's a data point, your essays, your extracurriculars, and all of the other things that I showed you on that first list. So what do you do if you decide that you want to see if a test score can help your child's application? What are the first steps you take? The first step you want to take is to consider a practice test. And a practice test is just a test that doesn't go on your record. Only you see it and your child sees it. It's not information for the school to see either. And these are offered for free many parts of our community, and we give them too most weekends. And practice tests are really helpful to get a baseline score. They're taken typically late in a child's sophomore year. So if you have a sophomore right now, this would be a time when you're thinking, okay, maybe my child will take this if they're taking an AP class, maybe after that AP exam or later in the spring or in the summer or so, they'll take a practice test. So I can see where they're starting out. Or they can take it junior year. If you have a junior right now and they've done nothing with test prep, it's okay. They can still take a practice test right now. And we can look at their score with you and help you determine how much they need to prep and how much it's going to take for them to improve their score, depending on where they want to go to school. So mock tests, either the SAT or the ACT, can really help in a couple of ways. Number one, they can provide a baseline so the student understands their natural strength and weakness. Although the PSAT has this information, when they take a real test, when they take a practice SAT, which is a retired real test, it helps to really see how they're going to score on the SAT in particular, which is different from the PSAT. The PSAT is easier and it's shorter. And it provides practice for the student with what it's like to see content at this high level, pacing, how much time they have for each question, and the stamina to power through a 3-hour test. It's also in a simulated testing environment. So all these things are really good just to get a point of entry for your student. If you're interested in taking a practice test, we have these on our website, and I can send that to you if you just text 55444 and the word college, and it will have all the dates of the upcoming mock tests, also called practice tests, so you can register if you'd like. All right, so which test for which school? Well, here's the thing. Parents often ask, which test should my child take? Should we keep going in the direction of the SAT because they're familiar with the PSAT, or should we go in a different direction, maybe with the ACT? It honestly doesn't matter. It comes down to how your student naturally scores and which test they're most comfortable with, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But every school that's test optional across the country or that's required takes either test, and they do not have a preference. So it honestly doesn't matter whether you sit for the SAT or the ACT. It sees them both as very acceptable tests. So what we do is when we have a student coming into us and the parent says, well, here are the PSAT scores. I'm not sure if they should keep going with the PSATs or in the SAT, or maybe look at the ACT. We'll often have the student, if they have time, sit for both tests. Take a practice SAT, take a practice ACT. We put them into a concordance table like this, and we can see which test they naturally score best on. Or maybe they just want to take the ACT. Although it's not a perfect comparison, we can still help parents and kids determine which test is going to be best for them, the SAT or the ACT. So we put these scores into a concordance table and we help the family decide which test is their natural strength. For about a third of students, there's a clear preference. There's a preference in terms of how they're best scoring. So we can see, oh, clearly this ACT is better than the SAT. Sometimes, and for about 2/3 of kids, it's a toss-up. It's really about the same. And for those students, it comes down to personal preference. Which test did you feel most comfortable with? Because there are differences. So let's talk about the SAT. The SAT is considered a power test, and that means that there are actually fewer questions in the ACT, but they're longer, they're wordier, and they require a lot of critical thinking and analysis. They require the student to think deeply about what they're being asked to do or the problem they're being asked to solve. There's a narrower scope of skills. So on the math section, it doesn't go quite as high as the ACT. The vast majority of the SAT and the ACT, in fact, are algebra 1 and algebra 2. But there are some trig questions on the ACT. The difficulty, however, on the SAT is in that interpretation and the analysis of just trying to figure out what they're asking you to do. Whereas the ACT is considered a speed test. The difficulty is in the pace, how quickly you have to go through each question. Sometimes kids will say to us, I didn't like how fast the ACT was. I felt more comfortable with the SAT because I could finish in time. Whereas other students will say to us, I like the ACT better because those questions, well, they felt more like what I see in school. I felt way more comfortable with what I was being asked to do. And that's because they're actually shorter questions and they're more straightforward. They're considered student friendly. There is a slightly broader scope of skills, especially in math on the ACT, but on this test, math is only a quarter of the test, whereas on the ACT, math is half of the test. And again, the difficulty is in the pacing or the speed. So if your child has accommodations, like extra time, and typically that's because they have a diagnosis of ADHD or maybe a learning disability, and they have an IEP or a 504. If you have a child in that bucket and they have accommodations, typically those kids do better on the ACT because you're just removing the hardest part, which is the timing component of it. And now you have time and a half. So the difficulty in pacing kind of goes away. So let's talk about those 4 sections on the ACT. There's math, and you can use a calculator for the whole section. There's reading, which is reading comprehension, reading passages, answering questions. There's writing, And there's no longer a free write where kids are given a prompt. That's gone away on both the SAT and the ACT. Instead, it's a grammar section where they're asked about sentence corrections and grammar, which is often difficult for kids. And then the last part is science. And the science part I found is the most coachable part of the ACT. Because it actually has nothing to do with what you've learned in school. It doesn't have biology or chemistry or physics. And sometimes we get kids who say, oh my gosh, I don't want to take the ACT. I'm not good at science. But actually the science on the ACT is looking at charts and graphs and interpreting and extrapolating information from what you're given. So it's easy, not easy, but it's easier to prepare for that section. On the ACT, a perfect score is 36 points, and that's the average of all 4 sections. All right, so, oh, and also it's just under 3 hours, coming in at 2 hours and 55 minutes. The SAT is different. And in a second, we'll also talk about the changes to this test because you probably heard that it's going digital. So we'll discuss that. But right now, for all of our current students, so sophomores and juniors right now, the SAT has 2 sections, and this will actually remain the same for younger students as well that are going to see this new digital version. But right now, there's a math and there's an evidence-based reading and writing. Right now, the math section is worth 800 points. That will not change. And then there's a calculator and there's a no calculator section. And there's also evidence-based reading and writing, which is really reading comprehension and grammar. So when you combine those 2 sections together, you get a total of 1,600 points, which is a perfect score. This test is a little bit longer at about 3 hours. So let's talk about the changes that are coming up. We know that the new test is going to be in digital format. So it's the paper and pencil method that we currently use with Scantron sheets and kids bubbling in. That's going to go away. So next year, the SAT, and that's also the College Board actually writes the SAT. They also write the PSAT and all the AP exams. The company is expanding into digital format next year internationally. And then a year after that, in 2024, in the spring of 2024, they're going to roll it out to the United States. So current freshmen are impacted, but not sophomores or juniors. And then the PSAT is going to debut next year in the fall. For right now, students that can take the PSAT are freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, depending on when your school offers it. So here are the changes. First, let's talk about what's staying the same. It's still going to be a 1,600 point scale. It's still going to be at a school or a test site. So it's not going to be like during the pandemic when kids could take the AP exams at their houses. It's not going to be like that. They still have to go to a test site and sit and take the exam there. And there will still be accommodations, just like there were before, or there are right now for eligible students. And the test itself is generally staying the same in terms of math and evidence-based reading and writing. Here are the changes. Again, all digital, no Scantron sheets, no paper and pencil. It's going to be shorter, 2 hours instead of 3. Right now on the SAT, there's short and there's long passages. Those long passages are going to be shortened, so they don't have to read so much and then answer questions. And then the math, right now there's a section that you can use a calculator, and then there's a no calculator section. The no calculator section is going to go away, so students can use a calculator on the whole test. And the other thing, obviously, since it's digital, to prevent cheating, the College Board is going to give a digital test that's specific to each child who registers. So it's not going to be the same thing for all of the kids. They're going to have their own unique footprint. And it's going to be offered more frequently, which I think is really helpful. And even more so, you'll get the score back very soon thereafter. So right now, when you take an SAT or an ACT, you need to wait 2 weeks before you get your score, which is a long time. You really want to know your score, but in the future, you'll get your score back after a couple of days. All right, so those are the changes to the test. Let's say you don't have a freshman, you have a current sophomore or a current junior. What do you do right now, and what is there to think about? Well, ideally, you're thinking about a strategy for taking tests. So I mentioned taking practice tests. That's a great idea to first determine which is your best test. And then you want to prepare for and take just that test. You don't have to take both tests. You don't have to submit both scores to schools. You really just want to spend your time and effort on the test that is best for you. It saves you time, it saves you effort, it saves you stress. And if you hire somebody to help you, it saves you money too. But when it comes down to taking your actual test, whether it's the SAT or the ACT, you want to have the strategy of picking 2 dates, not just saying, oh, I'm going to take the test and see how I do. That's helpful, but sometimes what happens is kids get back their scores and they don't have a plan about what to do next. And then they realize, oh, shoot, I haven't done anything. And now it's too late to sign up for the next test. So you want to pick 2 dates in your junior year. So right now, because we're in January, a junior would want to take the test if they're looking at the ACT, perhaps in April and June. So they prepare up until the April date, take the test, get the scores back, and then prepare again with their weak areas and take it again in June. So now they have 2 scores. The SAT, if you have a junior, can be taken now in March and in May. And in fact, kids can take these later than the spring. They can take this test all the way up until the fall of their senior year and still be able to submit the test scores for early action or early decision and have them done on time. And you submit those applications on November 1st. But statistically speaking, your best score, kids' best score, is going to be the spring of their junior year. And what I've seen happen in the business of helping students to prepare for these tests is in the last 5 years, or actually maybe even 6 or 7, there's been this huge push to early and often. So I see parents of sophomores signing their kids up in their sophomore year to take a test and really getting worried when they don't get good scores, or going all in the fall of their junior year and picking two test dates in the fall and just being done with it. But statistically speaking, your score will be the best in the spring of their junior year for multiple reasons. You're older, you're more mature, and you have more time in class. And so all those things help you to score better in the spring of your junior year. So even if right now you're a sophomore and you just want to be done with it in the fall, that's fine, but maybe consider taking it again in the spring and see if that test score is higher. We recommend that kids take a test 2 to 3 times. That's pretty average. And we're happy to help families with a testing plan. So when kids come and they take a practice test, which by the way, is virtual with a live proctor, so they can take the practice test in their own home. You know, they can roll out of bed on a Saturday morning at 9 and take a practice test. They get the scores back right away. And we're happy to help parents to determine, all right, number one, which test should you go for and prepare for and study for and take? And number 2, what is the timing of your test? Because it's honestly different for every student. Some kids are in sports and they have limited time to dedicate to preparing. Other kids have an open schedule at certain times of the year. Sometimes kids, feel stress greater than others, and they don't want to do anything in the spring because they want to get ready for AP exams. So it kind of varies by student, but we're happy to help you with that without any cost to you. All right, so there are ways kids can prepare for the test. If you have a really motivated student, they can get a book and practice independently. They can practice online, and there's a lot of free resources. If you haven't looked at Naviance through your school, and every public school student has a Naviance account. If you're in a private school, you either have Naviance or SCORE. And these are ways, these are portals that allow you to go in and see the test scores and the GPAs of students that are applying from your school to colleges and if they got in or not. But it also has free practice questions for kids that want to prepare for the SAT or the ACT. You can also prepare online through Khan Academy, and ACT has preparation online as well. You could take a group class with lots of other kids, or you can get tutoring, which is one-to-one. And I found that this right now in this environment has been really helpful to the students we work with, because they're coming to us kind of like Swiss cheese. You know, cheese, Swiss cheese has holes in the middle, and some of their learning is like that too. Some of it is solid, but they have these gaps, they have these holes in their learning, a lot in grammar and a lot in areas of math from the pandemic. So we'll shore up those weaknesses as we prepare them. And it is a little bit different for every student. So the other thing I would recommend is to space any preparation your child does over time. We don't subscribe to boot camps. We used to do them, and we compared our test score increases from one-to-one tutoring to a boot camp, and it wasn't even comparable. Boot camps, they just try to cram everything into kids' brains very quickly, and it doesn't always mean you're going to get a higher score. So space preparation over time, maybe once a week with some practice in between. That allows your brain to absorb information. So in terms of what you can do now, we've created checklists for you for each level of high school. So if you've got a high school freshman now, a sophomore or a junior, a senior right now, I don't think you're interested in this, but if you have a senior in the fall, this would be helpful. But we've created all of the things that you need to know for each level of your high school experience when it comes to improving, helping your child to stand out and improving their chances of acceptance. So what to do with not just in terms of the SAT and ACT, but also what might you think about for summers? What can help differentiate your child in the summer to help improve their application? Are there leadership roles during the school year your child can take? All of these things are in our checklist. And you can get these by texting 55444 and the word college. Everything is in this one place along with practice test dates. I've also mentioned that if you're stuck in terms of where you are, maybe you have a current sophomore or a freshman or a junior, and you're not sure of the avenue, we're happy to touch base with you and help you create a roadmap. For many years, we've helped kids with their applications in terms of creating a kind of timeline, what's due when, which schools, what essays do they have, helping them to complete all their essays. But we also just brought on board a college counselor who helps students create their lists in terms of a realistic safety target and reach list so that it's very clear what their chances of admittance are as they think ahead about the colleges that they want to attend. All right, so I'd love to go into Q&A now. Melissa, I see that we have some questions. And then after we're done with Q&A, I ask if you kindly would complete the survey. I'd love to know what was helpful for you in this webinar, what you learned, and what you'd like to learn in the future. And so I've created a takeaway survey that will pop up on your screen after we're done with the Q&A. So let's jump over to the Q&A, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I will start answering questions. All right, so let's see. For the test optional schools, do you know the percentage of students who were accepted that didn't provide scores? Here's what's tricky about that. Many parents want to know, what is the data? We did know with the test optional movement right before the pandemic, over 70% of school students were still submitting applications with scores. So even if the school said we're test optional, the majority of kids submitted scores. What we don't know right now is exactly what percentage of students are being accepted without scores. Only a few schools have provided that data. Schools have been really squirrely about it. They don't want to let people know what percentages are they accepting with the test score. UPenn was one of the schools last year that came out and said, I think it was either 71 or 72% of students they accepted provided a test score. And as we know, UPenn is a very selective school. So because there is great inflation across the board, and because many kids are applying to these elite schools with really great grades, the test score, I have to think, is helpful to them when they're looking at all very qualified kids. But there is a movement right now for schools to release their data. But the two schools that did, and I can't remember the other one, there's a school in California, the vast majority, not as competitive, they were also significantly considering accepting kids with a test score. Is it possible to get a copy of the slides? And yes, this has been recorded, so I will send them out. I will send this information out to you when we're done. Catherine asked, are testing dates the same as in all states? And will the test dates in Virginia be the same dates as in Pennsylvania? And the answer is yes. These are the same across the country. So when you go to the College Board website, is collegeboard.org, you can see that they have very specific dates for tests, and then for submitting your information and time. So if you have a date in mind, I would recommend you sign up sooner rather than later, so you meet the deadline and you don't have to pay a fee for a late enrollment. Can you talk about the optional essay writing sections of the SAT and the ACT, if applicable? So there is no optional essay writing anymore. Last year, the SAT and the ACT eliminated the free write section. The only writing portion now is sentence correction and grammar. There's no longer a free write essay, so kids don't have to worry about that. And it was on its way out anyways. You know, schools weren't even looking at those scores, so finally they just decided to take it away. Kind of like the subject tests. That was a big thing. If you have an older student who applied maybe 5 years ago, schools really wanted to see these specific subjects tests, like a physics test, a chemistry test, a literature test, but those have gone by the wayside as well. Let's see, can you talk more about students with ADHD? Can they accept it if they still don't do well after much prep and practice? Will schools take that into consideration? When your child applies to a school, the school doesn't see that your child has an IEP or a 504. You can tell them and they'll know, but that information is yours. It's protected by the Americans with Disability Act, so that if you don't want to be forthcoming and say, my child gets extra help at school, the college won't know. However, what I've found to be beneficial is that kids that have gotten accommodations in high school and they've used them, because there's a big difference. A lot of kids we work with, they don't want the, they may have the accommodations, but they never use them because they're embarrassed or they don't think they need them, or it's not that helpful. And so those are kids that won't use them in college either. So you may not apply asking for accommodations. On the other hand, if they're a big part of your child's life and they've relied on them, then you can still submit your application and you can divulge if your child has gotten extra help. And oftentimes kids will write essays about this. They'll talk about their ADHD, for example, and how they overcame the challenge. And that's often compelling to schools where they see that this child has, gone the extra mile to improve. But it's your information, just like test scores now are your information. You don't have to divulge that. And so if you're applying to a school where there's a lot of kids that have IEPs and 504s, I don't think that testing is going to be that big of a deal. It's likely a school that, doesn't they consider themselves a test optional school, but they don't look at the test so much. They're not that important in their decision making. Can you talk a little bit about your SAT tutors? How does the program work? So we make sure every child we have has a baseline so that we understand where they're starting. It could be a PSAT if it has to, but ideally it's an SAT. And then we decide what type of prep they're going to need, how much prep they're going to need, their starting date, when they're going to take the test. And then based on their profile, the type of tutor they do well with, we assign them a tutor who we think is going to be a really good fit, not just score wise, but personality as well. And typically they meet, it's virtual, an hour and a half once a week. And then there's some homework in between. So they're practicing the skills on their own. And at the end in the survey, I'll ask a question. Would you like us to follow up with you? And you can just type in your name and we'll follow up with you on that. I know, have you noticed a difference with regards to grades, AP honors classes, and acceptance for kids who attend private school versus public school? What I've noticed is that, first of all, there's a reader who reads just your school. So for example, if you have a child who goes to Flint Hill School in Oakton versus Madison High School in Vienna, which is public, so a private and a public, there's a reader that reads just Flint Hill. So they know exactly classes that have been available to those Flint Hill students. So it's not that they're comparing a Flint Hill kid to a Madison kid. They're comparing Flint Hill students to Flint Hill students. So I wouldn't as much worry, for example, my youngest son went to a private school, and if he had gone to a public school, he would have taken far more AP classes, but they were pretty adamant, this is where he should be. And we went with that, and he got into all the schools he applied to. So I'm not sure if it matters so much, just that at that particular school, did they do really well? Where are they compared to the other students? If they had the opportunity to take some of those classes, did they? Those are all things that matter. And by the way, who reads your essay? Like if you apply to Colorado State, and you can go online and see who is going to read your essay from your school, or you could call them or email and say, who's going to read my essay from Madison High School, or my application, I should say. And it's never a bad idea if that person comes on campus to make sure that you meet them. You can send them an email saying, I'm just so excited about Colorado State. I went on a tour. I loved it. I wanted to introduce myself to you, that type of thing. Those are all perfectly good things to do. If there is a sophomore now who already took the PSAT, but needs to take the SAT, ACT, is the digital SAT, it won't be in place until after they graduate. Yes, so if you have a sophomore now, this will not apply to your sophomore. This is only, the new changes in the test are only going to apply to kids that are, to freshmen and below. So you wouldn't need to worry about it. And I do know also that the ACT is working on a digital solution too. So it wouldn't be surprising if they come out with a digital option and they have that in place at around the same time as well. For a current sophomore, would you recommend the student to take a mock test in the late spring? And yes, I would. If your child is the kind who's a little bit anxious and they want to save all their energy for an AP exam or two in the spring, maybe they take the mock test after that AP exam. But if they have a free Saturday and they're not too stressed out in the spring, they can take it before then. But I would say and also over the summer is perfectly fine. They can really take it in the spring or in the fall of their junior year too. Can a student take both the SAT and the ACT, or do they have to choose between them? They can take both. So let's say that, you know, we work with kids all the time that say, I'm going to go for the ACT. I'm going to put all my effort into preparing for the ACT, and they'll study and they'll prepare and they'll take the ACT and they'll do well. And this has happened more than a handful of times. At the end of the day, you know, when they're kind of at the end of their testing, they're saying, you know what the heck, I'm just going to try the SAT and see what happens. And so they take the SAT as well. And if that score is really great, they'll submit it too. So there's nothing wrong with doing that approach too. The skills are somewhat transferable. If you're gonna, you know, if you're really gonna study for a test, I would recommend going for one and not split your focus. However, if you decide at the end, you just wanna see what happens with the SAT, you can take that too and you don't have to submit it. So yes, students can take both or they can pick one. Or again, if they never want to submit a score and their school is test optional and they have amazing grades and that's, you know, they don't want to submit a score, they don't have to either. You own your data. Let's see. Do you have virtual training programs or in person? And ours are virtual. We actually looked at our results from virtual versus in person, and we found that really the results were the same. They were virtually the same. What I found to be the most important thing with test preparation isn't really whether it's in person, but really the frequency of it and not cramming things into the last minute, but instead giving yourself a little bit of a runway and spacing it out and making sure that the student does the practice test. So within a program, we don't just assign a little bit of homework here and there. We'll also have the students sit for practice tests in the midst of their program. So we can see, all right, we prepared, they took a practice test. Let's look at that midterm practice test, see what we need to tweak, and then keep going on. Because the way that you increase your score within test preparation is actually not by practicing everything. It's not by working on what you're already good at. It's actually by seeing where your weakest areas are in prepping specifically in those areas. It doesn't mean you can't do a little bit in the areas that you're already good at, but if you want the biggest increase, that's going to give you the biggest bang. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the PSAT and the practice tests? Yes. So the PSAT is basically a shortened version of the SAT, and it's easier. It's also a scaled score. So the top score you can get is a 1510 instead of 1600. So kids can take, depending on their school, they can take a PSAT in their freshman, sophomore, or junior year. Some schools only offer it the junior year, some schools all three, some sophomore and junior. But if your child has a chance to take it and it's optional, I would say without a doubt, sign your child up for it because it does nothing but help. They get the flavor for what standardized testing is like, and it kind of puts their head in the game to think ahead about college. The difference between the PSAT and a practice test is that the content is different. The practice test is a retired real SAT or a retired real ACT. So it's going to be like what they see on the real test. It's harder and it's a bit longer than what kids see on the PSAT. So somebody asked, are private school students at a disadvantage because some of them did away with AP courses? And that was a trend a few years back that many very, very elite high schools, some in our area, said, you know what, the AP classes, they're just too structured. We don't want to do what the College Board says. We're going to come up with our own, really, our own classes that prepare kids for college. And so they stopped giving AP, they stopped having AP classes in their school. And so kids couldn't sit for the exam either. And the answer is, I don't think so, because the person who reads the applications from that particular school knows of the situation in that particular school. So they know the child hasn't been able to take any AP classes, but instead it's been substituted with something else. So they can see that in their transcript and they're well aware of it. My child has accommodations with the College Board for the PSAT, SAT, AP. Does the ACT accept those accommodations, or do you have to apply separately? You have to apply separately. So if you got accommodations for the SAT, it doesn't mean that you have them for the ACT, but it's actually gotten a million times easier in the last year or two to apply for accommodations. It used to be you had to jump through all these hoops and it was just a huge hassle. Now it's not so bad. So if you got accommodations for the SAT, it's very likely you'll get them for the ACT too. And so you'll just have to apply for those and then you'll get them there too. Does your company do practice SAT tests with extended time? And you said my child has time and a half, and that is the most common extended time. And the answer is yes. We would have to work that out with you individually. It may or may not be on our website, depending on when you want to take it with extra time. But if you contact us, and again, I'll put that survey up in just a minute, fill that out and we'll contact you and get that set up for you. Let's see. And can you match my son with a tutor who can help him increase his SAT score to a goal he has in mind? And it honestly depends on the score. You know, for the SAT or the ACT, it's not like you can expect a night and day difference in a very short period of time. Kids that have a little bit more runway, as I mentioned, and they're also willing to put in the time of doing practice tests and working a bit on their own with their tutor, they tend to have the greatest outcome. But it's very individualized based on where their starting point is and where they want to go. But we're happy to talk to you about that too. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for all of your questions. It was really awesome to see you today, and I so appreciate you being part of this. Again, if you want that information, text 55444, 55444, the word college. We'll get that to you. And Melissa, thank you for helping coordinate this with me today. I hope it was helpful. Please wait for the survey to pop up and take a moment to fill that out too. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining me.